Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. I'm really excited to bring you today's video. If you enjoy my content, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Let's get started. James was living a modest life in a small neighborhood by the river in New Orleans. Not just surviving, but he had built his life and found peace in it. He owned a small repair shop, fixing motors and solving all kinds of car problems. His workshop was a place that was always bustling with work, filled with jobs from the local townsfolk and surrounding villages. Sometimes noisy, sometimes calm, but always an integral part of life. For many it was just a workplace, but for James it was the focal point of his life. He loved his job because it was a space where he found meaning, earned the trust of people, and helped them during tough times. And most importantly, he spent the money he earned on his family and improving their quality of life. At home, he lived with his wife, Louise, and their two children, Sean and Molly. Their house was located on the outskirts of the town, right by the river. To James, the house wasn't just a building. It was a sacred place he had worked hard to create for his family. It was simple but peaceful in every way. There was a tranquility in the air, as if everything moved slowly and calmly. They had a garden near the house where the children could play, and in the evening, sitting down together and watching the slow flow of the river was a peaceful and soothing experience. This was their favorite time of day. For James, life was full of challenges, but it still held a special meaning. Between working on vehicles and motors in his shop, there were days when things were busy, and other days when it was quiet. But there was never a real financial struggle, and with Louise, they were able to provide for their family. Louise took care of the children at home and helped James with his work. Sean and Molly did well in school, sometimes even trying to assist their father. Everything was in its place, moving along just fine. The kids enjoyed spending time in the repair shop after school, and for James, these were precious moments. However, their peaceful life, like all peaceful lives, wasn't immune to the outside world's events. Hurricane season had arrived, and for James it had never been a topic of much interest. As in every year, hurricanes were being talked about, but because they had never had a significant impact, James didn't think the storms would affect his life. Such things were a part of life in New Orleans. Hurricanes would come, sometimes, causing great destruction, sometimes passing by without much incident. James, though he listened to the hurricane warnings every year, never took them seriously. In the past, everything always returned to normal after a little rain, so he didn't give it much thought. At first, Hurricane Katrina seemed like just another storm to James, as it did to everyone else. As the storm approached New Orleans, James didn't take the situation seriously. The changing weather, the sudden winds and rain were typical for the town, disrupting the usual routine. People generally made preparations for the storm, reinforcing their homes and keeping their things packed away, but nothing major ever happened. James, too, didn't see the hurricane as a real threat. Even when the warnings came in, he preferred to continue working in his shop instead of going home. After all, such warnings in the past never turned into anything significant. A little rain and everything would go back to normal, but Katrina's strength and the destruction it was about to bring were something entirely different. Meteorologists were warning of the size and trajectory of the storm, but like many others, James didn't fully understand the severity of the disaster. Even though the storm was just a few miles away from the town, James didn't see it as a real threat. He was too preoccupied with his work, his daily tasks, and spending time with his family to take the storm seriously. In the last few evenings before the storm hit, Louise and the children seemed calm as usual. Perhaps the storm hadn't caused much anxiety for them either. The kids were listening to the sounds of the river before bed, and Louise and James enjoyed a quiet dinner, not really worrying about when the storm would pass. Everything seemed normal. Life was continuing in its routine. But as Katrina rapidly approached that evening, James began to sense that something was wrong. This wasn't just a storm. It was the precursor to something much bigger, a catastrophe. But this realization came just before it was too late. The hurricane was approaching at full force, stronger than ever before. At first, James didn't feel great fear as the storm approached. The weather had gotten strangely intense. The winds were picking up. The sky quickly darkened with clouds. But James struggled to accept that the storm could cause the level of destruction that was being predicted. Like many others, James had seen hurricanes in the past that didn't leave a major impact. Every year when hurricane season arrived, the townspeople would worry a little and prepare their homes. But most of the time, these hurricanes would turn into ordinary storms and pass. However, this time the situation was different. Meteorologists and local authorities were warning the public about the strength and impact of the storm. Many people did not take these warnings seriously, as the townspeople generally believed that hurricanes didn't always lead to bad outcomes. Still, the large-scale disasters and losses outside the town increased the number of those concerned about the hurricane. As a result, James had to start preparing his belongings with his wife Louise and children. However, at the same time, they didn't believe the hurricane would actually reach their home. The atmosphere at home grew more tense with each passing hour. As James organized his things, he couldn't help but notice Louise's anxious look. Louise had always been a worrywart, but this time her anxiety was truly different. There was a fear in her eyes that came from someone who had just realized the true seriousness of the hurricane. Louise had received hurricane warnings many times before, but none of them had ever seemed like such a big threat. The children, though they didn't know much about the hurricane, could feel their mother's tension. Little Sean was quickly picking up fallen objects and trying to help his mother. Molly, who was more concerned about the school being canceled due to the storm, was becoming more anxious. However, they still had no clear idea of how serious the hurricane was. As James continued to prepare, he still hadn't gotten a clear understanding of how much destruction the hurricane would cause. However, when he went outside to visit his neighbor, he saw the magnitude of the concern more clearly. His neighbors were preparing nervously, and there was uncertainty on everyone's faces. Some were trying to park their cars in safer places, while others were reinforcing their doors. Some neighbors seemed to be exaggerating the destructive power of the storm, while others were simply waiting for it to pass. After a brief conversation with them, James returned home, still unsure of the scale of the storm. But this time, the anxious behavior of his neighbors started to make him think differently. Was the hurricane really heading toward their house? Was a big disaster truly coming? James still couldn't believe there would be such massive destruction. Many people in his town hadn't evacuated, thinking the storm would be a temporary event. But with each passing hour, the threat of the hurricane became more real. As hours went by, the approach of the storm became more evident. The winds had picked up, and the sounds of roofs creaking could be heard in some places. James continued to prepare the house, but he still felt unprepared. Louise and the children were packing things into boxes, trying to do what they could to protect themselves from the hurricane. However, James felt a sense of emptiness inside. The hope that everything would be normal was gradually fading away. Later that night, when they realized the hurricane was near, they had to make a series of decisions. As they continued to pack, James finally realized the true threat the hurricane posed, but they still hadn't decided to leave. James and his family wanted to see what was happening outside before the storm got any closer. However, as the hurricane rapidly approached and local authorities called for evacuations, many still resisted leaving their homes. Some neighbors had already left, but most chose to stay. Within their own minds, there was uncertainty, but as James continued preparing, his fear grew. Despite the lingering doubt in his mind about the magnitude of the disaster, they hadn't made any real plans for how to protect themselves. That evening, as the storm moved closer, everything seemed darker and changed more quickly. Fear and anxiety had turned the hurricane from just a storm into something far more serious, and James still didn't have any answers in his mind. James and his family hadn't fully grasped how serious the hurricane was, but Katrina was rapidly heading toward New Orleans, signaling that a terrible disaster was about to strike. When Hurricane Katrina reached New Orleans, James's life changed uncontrollably. At first, he had trouble understanding the power of the storm and the destruction it would bring. The hurricane swept everything around it, but James still couldn't fully comprehend the scale of the disaster. The strong winds and heavy rain of the storm were initially frightening, but he couldn't bring himself to believe how serious it was. However, within a few hours, the hurricane's destructive effects began to make themselves painfully clear, as a first measure, James, who had chosen to stay at home that terrifying night as the hurricane approached, took his family to a safe place. However, when he woke up in the morning and went outside, the entire town was flooded. Everything around their home seemed lost. Outside, chaos ruled as the wind speed and water levels rapidly increased. Their house, filled with everything James had accumulated throughout his life, was surrounded by water. But the sight he saw in the morning revealed the full extent of the devastation caused by the hurricane. Everything around their home was submerged. The water had risen to the foundation level, and James immediately felt the trauma of losing the rooms, belongings, and everything he had. For hours, the hurricane had surrounded their home, and the water levels continued to rise. Outside, his neighbors' homes and buildings were also submerged. James realized that there was nothing left of his old life. Behind the collapsed walls, there was only debris. His workshop, the small business where James made a living, had been completely destroyed. This small repair workshop, which held great meaning for him, had been obliterated by the hurricane. His tools, equipment, and materials he had accumulated over the years were swept away in the water. In that moment, he began to comprehend the magnitude of what he had lost: his car, his business, his possessions, but most importantly, the foundational aspects of his life. In the aftermath of Katrina's devastation, James first felt a deep sense of shock. It still seemed like an unimaginable and distant feeling. At that moment, it felt nearly impossible to truly understand the seriousness of the situation and the extent of the losses. They had to leave their home with their family. The town had become disconnected and chaotic due to the disaster. People were lost, displaced from their homes. James felt like a stranger amidst all the destruction. The hurricane had drastically changed his life. Seeing the devastation around him made him realize how everything around him could disappear in an instant. At that moment, he fully understood how difficult it would be to rebuild his home, his business, and his life. He began to grasp the value of what he had lost. Even the loss of material possessions and supplies now seemed trivial compared to the deeper loss of everything that formed the foundation of his daily life. James realized that the hurricane had left behind only emotional voids, fear, and helplessness. Seeing that his car was also lost was one of the moments when these losses became tangible. His car was vital for transporting his family and commuting to work. Now, with his car gone, it created a huge obstacle for how he would manage daily life. In all these losses, he found the most profound impact in reflecting on his loved ones and the life he had built with them. Most importantly, he realized how the devastation brought by the hurricane would make it incredibly difficult to rebuild his life with his family. As days passed, the effects of the hurricane's devastation became more apparent. The townspeople had lost their homes, their businesses, and their memories. While James had survived, the loss of everything had become an excruciating reality. He had lost his job, his home. However, the only thing left in his life was his family. He had to somehow inspire them to stay strong and start over. When James realized how challenging survival after the hurricane was, he knew he couldn't let negative thoughts take over for even a moment. He tried to rekindle hope for himself and his family. However, it was difficult to say how easy or hard that would be. James's life had suddenly turned chaotic and grim, a reality where everything had vanished. After the initial devastation of the hurricane, they had entered a phase where everything needed to be rebuilt. But James knew he had to hold on to something, find a glimmer of hope, or else the voids left by everything he had lost would persist forever. In the aftermath of the hurricane's destructive effects, James's life reached a turning point. A process began where everything needed to be rebuilt for a new beginning. This journey would not only fill the voids left by the losses, but would also reshape survival, resilience, and hope. The hurricane had deeply affected not only James's material world but also his most valuable possessions. After the hurricane, just like everything in New Orleans, His family's life had been completely turned upside down. While struggling with the hurricane's devastating effects, James's greatest fear was losing his family. In the first hours of the hurricane, they did everything they could to ensure the safety of his wife and children. However, with the terrifying speed and force of the hurricane, everything quickly spiraled out of control. James thought he had lost his family. His wife and children, realizing the danger, had decided to temporarily leave their home before the storm. But in such a confused and chaotic environment with all communication cut off, they had no idea where they were. James tried every possible way to find his missing family. He tried to communicate with search and rescue teams, but everything had become so chaotic that communication was nearly impossible. In the aftermath of the hurricane, everything had been destroyed. Buildings had collapsed, roads were blocked, and infrastructure had crumbled, making communication networks completely paralyzed. Throughout the city, essential resources like cell phones, internet connections, and electricity lines had been cut off. As James desperately tried to reconnect with his family every day, he also had to come to terms with the chaotic situation around him. As days passed, hopelessness and fear pushed him into deep loneliness and uncertainty. Since the day his family had gone missing, James desperately searched for traces of them every morning. In an environment where everything had been lost due to the hurricane, finding a missing family was even more difficult. As people tried to escape, they got separated, homes were flooded, and many had lost their homes, jobs, and memories. James tried to go to the nearest help center to find his family, but all they knew was the magnitude of the chaos caused by the hurricane. People had gone missing, some were found dead, and others could not be found at all. Every day, James continued to listen to reports of missing people, still holding on to hope. One day, while trying to communicate with the rescue teams, he was told that he might receive information about a group of missing persons. James immediately joined the team, but the results were disappointing every time. He couldn't find any trace of his family. The hurricane's devastating power had torn people apart and created a huge rift among the townspeople. While James was receiving discouraging news about missing persons, he kept searching for ways to reach his family. In his mind, besides the loss of his family, he constantly questioned the loss of his home, his business, and his town. None of his old life existed anymore. However, the greatest pain was the thought of losing his family. The absence of his family felt like an increasingly heavy burden with each passing moment. There were so many losses that James spent every day trying to find them. But every day it seemed like the number of missing people was increasing and hope was fading. Each day when he heard news about missing people, James's heart broke once again. The tragedies among the survivors after the hurricane, the deep uncertainties and fears about the fate of the missing people left deep scars on James's soul. While rescue efforts continued, the growing agony of not being able to find his family became an unbearable pain for him. During this time, as James saw the vast debris in the area after the hurricane, searching for missing people, he also felt the wreckage of his own soul. Each loss, each lost life, made him feel as though he too had disappeared. His family, one of the most valuable things in his life, reminded him of the massive loss of everything, both material and emotional. As the days went by, James's mental state worsened, and with the passage of time it became harder to accept the difference between the missing and the dead. At night, when he laid his head on the pillow, the faces of his missing family would come to mind, while during the day he would search gloomily for their whereabouts. This process had slowly worn James down both physically and emotionally. Every day, every hour, he had to face the disappearance of his family and sacrifice more of himself to try and bring back the lost lives. On one side, the fear and uncertainty he lived with, and on the other, the search for traces of his missing loved ones were leading James into a dead end. The disappearance of his family had become James's greatest fear, and every moment he realized how difficult it was to cope with the losses, he understood that there was no life left to be left behind. He had experienced the greatest destruction of his life, yet he still carried the hope of somehow finding his missing family. The hurricane had ravaged New Orleans, and James had become lost amid the destruction around him. He had lost everything: his home, his car, his business, and most importantly, his family. In that moment, he felt as if he were stuck in a void, thinking he had experienced the greatest loss of his life. Yet somehow he had survived, and in the struggle to survive, he had to find a spark of hope. After the hurricane, two main questions remained in James's mind. What would he do? Where would he start? The city had turned into a war zone after the natural disaster. Everywhere was filled with debris, buildings had collapsed, roads were blocked, and everything was submerged in water. Relief teams had started arriving in the town, but these aids were mostly temporary solutions for first aid and basic needs. James had been searching for a way to rebuild his life amidst the vast destruction. The first few days were the hardest. He didn't know what to do, where to go. Chaos reigned among the people: missing persons, the dead, those in need of help, and the temporary shelters. Everything was so confusing. Despite it all, James realized he was alive, and somehow he needed to adapt to this new reality. However, the magnitude of what he had lost left a void in his mind. The disappearance of his family and the lack of any news about them was his greatest worry. Yet his survival instinct kept him anchored to life. Soon, James began to connect with other survivors. Others, also lost or affected, were trying to come together. While these early contacts didn't remove the feeling that the town had been completely wiped out, a spark of hope began to form within James. In the midst of the massive devastation, people started helping each other, working together in solidarity. Many local organizations were distributing food, water, and medicine in the streets to assist those in need. James joined these efforts, looking for a way to help both himself and others. As time went on, James intensified his search for work and temporary shelters. Many businesses had closed after the hurricane, and in an environment where the economy was severely damaged, finding a job seemed nearly impossible. However, James was determined to do whatever it took to survive. Various relief organizations were offering temporary jobs to volunteers and victims. James started doing small tasks at first, but it helped him regain his footing. Working temporary jobs provided him with both financial stability and a sense of purpose. Each day he could stand a little stronger and help more people. At the same time, James had to face the reality of his missing family. He had tried every possible way to contact them, but the hurricane's destructive force and the collapse of communication networks had left him with no news. Accepting that his family was lost was a difficult step for James. However, during the first weeks after the hurricane, survival was the only thing that mattered. Rebuilding his life without his family initially felt cold and foreign, but he realized that the only way forward was to take steps ahead. Over time, James began to gather more information about the aftermath of the hurricane. Rescue teams and aid organizations had launched extensive search efforts to find the missing. James continued to visit the relief centers every day to ask about the missing, holding on to a shred of hope despite his diminishing optimism. As the days passed, his efforts to build a new life slowly started to gain more meaning. Focusing on basic needs in the post-hurricane city, James began helping and encouraging those around him. James's life began to take shape again with each passing day. Finding work and taking on temporary jobs, though seemingly small and insignificant at first, became crucial steps toward establishing a stable life. His fight for survival on one hand, and his determination to start anew on the other gave him strength. Rebuilding his life began to ease the pain of everything he had lost. One day, an organization managing the post-hurricane relief efforts offered James a job. What started as a temporary opportunity eventually grew into something more substantial. James decided to embrace this new opportunity, putting aside his hopes of finding his missing family and focusing instead on creating a fresh start for himself. That day, for the first time since the hurricane, James saw a light of hope for the future. James's struggle symbolized not only the loss of a life but also the rebirth of a person and his determination to survive. Amid the destruction and loss, he discovered the importance of creating a new beginning. In one of the darkest corners of the post-hurricane world, James despite having lost everything, continued to rise and fight to build a new life. Months had passed, and James began to accept that finding his lost family after the hurricane was likely a distant dream. Amidst the devastation and uncertainty, he spent each day fighting to survive. Though he had managed to recover financially through temporary work, his missing family never left his mind. Search and rescue teams worked tirelessly to locate the missing, but James's hope faded more with each passing day. Then, one day, he received an unexpected phone call. James heard the unexpected sound of his phone ringing early one morning, a sound he was unaccustomed to. As he picked it up, he didn't recognize the number, but his heart began to race. A glimmer of hope sparked within him. The possibility of hearing news about his missing family was too strong to ignore. On the other end of the line was someone who would change James's life. The caller was an official from a relief organization working in a temporary camp far from New Orleans. They informed James that his wife and children, who had been displaced by the hurricane, were safe and staying at the camp. The official shared details about his family's whereabouts, and after the call, a plan was made to reunite them. James, still in a state of disbelief, held on to the phone, feeling a sense of hope rising within him, yet his emotions were mixed. He had no idea how to piece together the shattered details of his pre-hurricane life, but for the moment, this small hope was enough to give him a glimpse of the future. The relief worker assured him that his family was healthy and safe, and arrangements were made for James to meet them at the camp. Not long after, James set off to find his family. The journey was filled with anxiety, but also a sense of hope. After months of uncertainty and fear, this reunion would be one of the most significant moments in James's life, both mentally and emotionally. Upon arriving at the camp, he carefully surveyed the area and called out his wife and children's names. Moments later, he saw them walking toward him, eyes filled with tears but smiles on their faces. That moment, the pain of all the destruction and loss seemed to lighten. While their return didn't restore everything that had been lost, it sparked new hope in James's heart. The first moment he embraced his family was indescribable. As they held each other, it was as though they had forgotten all the hardships and losses they had endured. Their shared embrace erased the pain of the lost days and the terror they had lived through in the midst of the storm. But this reunion didn't mean everything was back to normal. James knew that even though he had found his family, everything they had lost could never be returned. Living together in the temporary camp, James and his family began to question if starting over was possible. Though it was only a temporary solution, the camp felt like a rebirth for them. Amidst the destruction the hurricane had caused, this new environment brought them closer together. They began talking about the next steps, accepting that everything they had known was gone. Still, being together gave them the strength to begin rebuilding their lives. Over the next few weeks, James and his family left the camp and moved to a small settlement outside the town. Here, they learned to trust each other and the community around them again. Yes, the hurricane had taken everything, but it had also left them with the power of being together. James accepted their losses but was grateful that they had been reunited. Much needed to be rebuilt, but together they had no choice but to keep fighting to survive. James realized how important it was to make a fresh start and leave the past behind. The hurricane had destroyed his life, but it had also taught him how valuable survival was. Life was a process where things never went as planned, but the key to overcoming the greatest disasters was having family by your side. Months later, James and his family began making plans to move forward. Though James had not been able to find his old job, he had started looking for work in a new sector. His family, too, began reconnecting with the community, working toward creating a new life. Despite the hurricane's devastating force, rising again and surviving, knowing they couldn't get back everything they lost, became their source of strength. The deep pain left by the storm was slowly healing. As long as the family stayed together, they believed they could face the future with hope. Beyond the destruction and losses, the resolve to build a life together grew stronger in James's heart each day. Rebuilding his lost life after everything had been destroyed meant that surviving and taking the first step toward a new beginning was the most powerful action he could take.